The Ankh is the Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol for the word life, and it appears everywhere in ancient Egyptian iconography. For example, check out this carving of the god Horus, literally giving life to the pharaoh Ramses II like it's some sort of pill. Or check out this amulet currently housed in the British Museum, which dates between 700 and 400 BCE. People would have carried or worn objects like this for protection against sickness or harm. But its similarity to the Christian cross has led many conspiracy theorists to argue that it inspired the latter. This follows a similar line of logic, arguing that Christianity ripped off its story of Jesus' resurrection from some dying or rising god myth, or that Jesus is a copy of some Egyptian god. Most of these conspiracy theories are misleading, overblown, or completely false, but this one in particular, Ankh to cross, has a little bit of truth to it, but in a very specific case. Check this out. This is a page from a Christian New Testament manuscript dating to the 4th or 5th century CE. It's written in Coptic, which is the language that flourished in Egypt during late antiquity. The last page of the manuscript has a big cross that looks a lot like an Ankh. This is called the crux ansata, a handled cross. Coptic Christians in Egypt have used this variation of the cross for centuries, and the Ankh probably inspired its shape. Another striking example can be seen from the scrap of fabric dating to the 5th century CE. Ankhs with little Christian crosses inside the loop, particularly this one, this chi-rho symbol here, which is the widespread symbol that means Christ. But what does the crux ansata tell us about Christianity in late antique Egypt? And more broadly, what does it illustrate about religious assimilation and the mixing of iconographies from different religious traditions? I'll be arguing that rather than a sloppy case of plagiarism, this demonstrates how early Christians were embedded in their cultural contexts, sometimes adapting Christianity to their indigenous cultures, and sometimes not. First, let's deal with the inspiration behind the more popular T-shaped Christian cross. This may go without saying, but the ubiquitous symbol of the cross means to evoke the crucifixion of Jesus from the gospel narratives. And there's enough Roman evidence about crucifixion that we don't need to blame Egyptian influence. Although the Gospels don't describe the shape of the cross, there seems to be a few standard ways that Romans executed people by crucifixion, so early Christians would have been pretty familiar with the available shapes. The Roman philosopher Seneca, for example, says that people were sometimes hung upside down or simply impaled on a stake, but the Roman author Lucian implies most crosses were T-shaped when he accuses the Greek letter tau for inspiring tyrants to imitate its shape for crucifixion. Moreover, some of the earliest non-biblical Christian texts, written maybe a century after Jesus' crucifixion, suggests that the T-shape had already become the dominant form among early Christians. The Epistle of Barnabas, for example, mentions the cross of Jesus being the shape of a tau. Justin Martyr writes that the cross was made of 2 beams. Our earliest archaeological depictions of the Christian cross also demonstrate the T-shape was most popular. Graffiti from Rome dating to around 200 shows a donkey-headed man being crucified, possibly an anti-Christian insult. Another early example includes this remarkable magic gem, probably from Asia Minor or Syria, that depicts the crucified Jesus on a T-shaped cross. It's been dated to the 3rd century CE. Okay, so crucifixion was the inspiration behind the Christian cross, even though the Gospels don't mention its exact shape. But there were variations, and the crux ansata was a very popular variation in Egypt in particular. Now, we don't know when it was adopted into Christian use, but one of the earliest examples appears in the Gospel of Judas, which dates to the 3rd to 4th century CE. We have textual evidence of this adoption too. The late antique church historian Socrates Scholasticus records an episode where Egyptian Christians and polytheists argue over who owns the symbol of the Ankh. According to the story, it was found on the temple of the god Serapis in Alexandria, and the Christians insisted that it was their symbol, which illustrates that the similarities were noticed even way back then in late antiquity. So, what does the crux ansata illustrate about the rise of Christianity? While researching this episode, 2 terms kept popping up in my mind that we should cover here: Christianization and syncretism. Historians have long used the term Christianization to describe the process of Christianity's growth in the late antique period, while syncretism is generally defined as mixing or amalgamating elements of multiple religious traditions. The crux ansata could be thought of as a Christianized Ankh. It could also be thought of as an example of syncretism, but both of these processes are often talked about in abstract terms. I want to highlight the active role people took in adapting their own native cultures to Christianity. Remember, Christianity spread to Asia Minor, to Syria, to Egypt, and to Ethiopia, and all of these regions had centuries-old cultural habits that didn't just stop when Christianity came onto the scene. One example includes the ritual incubation. Greeks and Romans were known to have slept over at the temples of the medical god Asclepius, hoping for the god to visit them in their dreams, and this ritual continued into the early Christian period. But instead of sleeping over at temples to Asclepius, they slept over at shrines of Christian saints. Same with amulets. Everyone made amulets to protect themselves from demons or sickness, but eventually people started adapting Christian motifs for their magical objects. Other times they mixed all together, like this amulet, which has the Greek solar and lunar gods alongside Christian symbols. Sure, sometimes Christianization was done through force, such as how Christian authorities forcibly converted temples like the Parthenon into churches, loud and proud messages to the population that a new power is in town. But I view examples like the crux ansata as an example of a much more subtle form of Christianization, an active process of adapting indigenous Egyptian culture with the new religious framework. No religion develops out of a vacuum, and ultimately the crux ansata exemplifies this, how religious symbols, beliefs, and rituals have a history of their own, and how people adapt and invest them with new meaning. Part of the job of the historian is to identify both the changes in culture that occur from year to year, but also the continuities. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.